Today's story involves a case that came before a judge in Kennewick, Washington. Kennewick is a small town in southeast Washington, and the case emerged out of an incident involving a couple of young men. The year was 1996, and these two guys, college students, were enjoying themselves in a park on the banks of the Columbia River. This particular park was owned and operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It turns out that this is an important part. It's the Corps of Engineers that's involved here. And these two guys, maybe they were drinking beer, it seems to have been late in the afternoon one day, and they were walking along the banks of the Columbia River. Apparently the water had been high in the river recently, and it had done some eroding of the banks. And it uncovered something that struck these guys' attention. What it uncovered was a human skull. Well, the two guys were shocked, as you might imagine, and they tried to decide among themselves, what do you do about this? And one of them said to the other, well, you know, we got to call the police. We got to call the sheriff. And this probably is somebody who got killed. This might be a murder victim, a missing person, and so we got to report it. So they did, and they called the local sheriff. And the sheriff, they said, okay, we got this skull, we got this body. And actually, at this point, all they saw was the skull. So we got this skull, and the sheriff said, all right, I'll send over the coroner. And the sheriff did. The coroner was the person who investigates the death and tries to figure out, you know, what the cause of death was, and was this an accident? Was it foul play? Was this a murder victim? What was it? So the coroner comes over, and he starts, you know, poking around a little bit, and he sees that there's more to these remains than a skull. And he digs a little bit, and he gets several bones, until finally and the guys are still there, and they're looking around, and they see that he's got almost an entire skeleton, human skeleton. And as he's unearthing this skeleton, he realizes that this isn't exactly a dead body. This isn't, it's not a recent skeleton. He knows enough about his business to know that this is a really old skeleton. So he gets on the phone and he calls in a friend of his who is an archaeologist at a local college, local university. And the archaeologist comes over, and he's real interested because archaeologists deal with old skeletons and dead bodies from a long time ago. And the archaeologist starts examining this, and he says, you know, this is pretty old. This isn't something that's 20 years old or 30 years old. This could be 100 years old or 150 years old. And the archaeologist was looking at it, and he'd seen skeletons before, and he said, this looks like it could have been maybe somebody who was out here during pioneer days, because it looks like a European or somebody of European descent. The skulls seem to have that kind of those angles to it in the general appearance. And so he thinks, well, okay, so maybe it's a trapper from the old days of the fur trade, or it could have been somebody associated with one of the Protestant missions. There were Methodist missions in this area, in the area of Kennewick, Washington. And so maybe it's one of those. But he looked a little bit further, actually. So the archaeologist and the coroner decide to take the skeleton back to the archaeologist's lab. This is an important part in the story as well, and something you're going to have to make a judgment on. So they take it back to the lab rather than to the sheriff's office, rather than to the headquarters of the police. They're treating this as a scientific matter rather than a victim of crime or something like that. So they get back to the lab, and the archaeologist takes a closer look at the skeleton, particularly at the teeth. And he says, there's something strange about these teeth. And the other guy's there, so what's so strange about the teeth? Well, they don't show any signs of cavities. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that this skeleton is really old. I mean, really old, because if this is a European or somebody of European descent, I mean like an American, and it has no signs of cavities, well, it doesn't fit together because it suggests that this is a person who lived before the agricultural revolution, before people started eating things like bread or rice or corn. This guy has the teeth, and he says a guy because they could tell from the size and the shape of the bones that this was a male. And this looks like somebody who was from the Stone Age, somebody before agriculture, somebody who ate, well, what in those days would be called the paleo diet, the Paleolithic diet, the old Stone Age diet before agriculture, when people ate mostly meat and things that didn't stick to your teeth and give you cavities. So cavities are something that came along after the invention of agriculture, of farming, where people ate a lot more plant food and sort of soft plant food that does stick to your teeth. Anyway, so he says, this is really old. This must be thousands of years old. Now this was getting exciting because this archaeologist being a scientist, wanted, that'd be great if he made this great find that revolutionized archaeology, at least of this particular part of America. And so they do some more investigating and they find something else. It's a telltale sign, but it was very striking and just as exciting, maybe more exciting. In I'll call it the guy's leg bone, because it's a guy, it's a skeleton, the male skeleton, leg bone, there was the tip of a stone spear or arrow embedded in the bone. So clearly this guy had been involved in some kind of violent confrontation. It could have been a fight, it could have been a raid, it could have even been a battle. And he got hit by this stone point. And it certainly suggests that at the time this happened, stone-pointed arrows or spears were the state of the military, the weapons art. So this was going to be thousands of years old. So now he pulls out some of the more sophisticated equipment and he does a radiocarbon date on it. And he gets an estimate of 9,000 years old. Now this is really exciting because no skeleton this old had ever been discovered in this part of North America. There were some skeletons that went back to 11 or 12, 13,000 years old, but they were in South America. They were far away. Nothing this old had ever been found. No human remains this old had ever been found in this part of, well, certainly Washington. So the archaeologists think, I'm going to become famous. Now, Kennewick, Washington is a small town, and word got out, especially since at this point, the archaeologist is thinking, there's nothing particularly, no reason to keep this secret. He sort of wishes he had kept it secret, but nothing to keep this secret, and so word gets out. And the skeleton is starting to be called around the area Kennewick Man. Kennewick for the city, and man because he's a guy. Kennewick Man. And the town fathers, the mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, they're thinking, oh boy, this is going to put Kennewick on the map, and tourists are going to come, and we're going to do lots of business. So, anyway, this is the state of play in this story, the story of Kennewick Man, when word gets a little bit farther out and creates a controversy. And the controversy emerged when the word of Kennewick Man, the story of Kennewick Man and his existence, and the fact that it's this strange-looking guy, this European-looking guy, 9,000 years old, when word gets out to two different groups who had a strong interest in this affair, in this story. And the two groups are, first of all, the local alliance of Native Americans. There are some American Indian reservations in the area whose inhabitants are descendants of, or members of the tribes that had existed in this part of Washington and nearby Oregon since the 19th century, and since centuries before that as well, but these are the people who were descended from these tribes. And they were upset by this because they took the position that any old skeleton, any skeleton this old, was one of their ancestors. And for understandable reasons, Native Americans in the United States and elsewhere have gotten annoyed, angry, really put out over the years by what they see as the desecration of the resting sites of their ancestors. Because there had been lots of cases of deliberate desecration of graves, people digging and trying to find old artifacts that they would sell. Museums, in fact, would send out expeditions to get these old bones, which, by the way, was one of the reasons that the archaeologist thought, well, this doesn't look like any of those bones. That's why he thought it was different. But anyway, so the local tribe was the Umatilla Indians. So the representatives of the Umatilla Indians said, in fact, they took the case to court, and this is where you're going to be the judge. They take the case to court, saying that this skeleton belongs to us, and it must be handed over to us immediately. They didn't go with this Kennewick man stuff. They called him the Ancient One, because the Umatilla Indians, as many Indian tribes in North America, have origin tales of their long ago ancestors, and they often call them the Ancient Ones. So this was one of the Ancient Ones, and they wanted the bones. They wanted the bones back. And they were going to put them in some safe burial site where the bones would never be disturbed. So this is the position they take to court. They have a powerful ally in, well, it's going to sound like an odd ally. The ally is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now remember, this is the group that owned the park where the bones were found. So presumably the Corps of Engineers, a division of the United States Army, has some proprietary whole claim on the bones. And the Corps of Engineers sides with the Indians, saying that this is an Indian skeleton. It must be returned to the Indians. Now, the reason that the position of the Corps of Engineers seemed surprising was that for the previous century, nearly, or half a century at least, the Corps of Engineers had been one of the Indians' principal enemies, or at least in the opinion of the Indians, because the Corps of Engineers had built the series of dams along the Columbia River that had flooded Celilo Falls and a series of rapids known as the Dalles and the Cascades, where the Indians came every year to capture, to catch, to spear the migration of salmon. And this made the Indians in that part of North America wealthier in sort of material standards of living than just about any other Indians in what would become the United States. And it basically impoverished them. They already were suffering from the diseases imported by immigrants to the area and people who were coming from the eastern United States. And they were, in very bad shape by the 1920s and 1930s. The 1930s was when the dams started being built. And with the destruction of the salmon runs and their places to gather them, then they became impoverished as well. So the Umatilla and other Indians of the area were distrustful of the Corps of Engineers because, the way they saw it, the Corps of Engineers was responsible for the poverty in which many of them lived. So they were surprised that the Corps of Engineers took their side. But the Corps did. And the Corps did primarily because, well, it wasn't out of any excessive interest in the Indians per se, but the Corps of Engineers had more plans for navigational and other works on the Columbia River, and they knew that the Indians, by bringing lawsuits against them, could stall these projects for years, decades perhaps. So they wanted to do a good turn to the Indians in order to get the Indians on their side for future projects. Anyway, so here are the people who are bringing a lawsuit to court. That is your court, so you're the judge and you're going to have to make this decision. So on the one side, you've got the Indians and the Corps of Engineers saying that the skeleton has to go back in the ground. It has to be handed over to the Indians, and they will bury it in a safe place. Now on the other side, who's taking the other side? Well, the other side is the archaeologist, and the archaeologist made known to the larger community of archaeologists and the scientific community generally that this is a landmark bit of evidence in the advance of science. And so the scientific community, various scientific groups, weigh in on the side of the archaeologist saying, no, 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 this is not one of the Indians, it's not one of their people. Just take a look at this. This is somebody different. And this is really important and exciting because we scientists are still trying to figure out how North America was peopled. We know that people weren't here forever. We know that there weren't humans or human ancestors here 50,000 years ago. That they came from, well, the current thinking was they came from Siberia across the land bridge that opened in the Ice Age when Siberia was connected to Alaska. And so we think we have it down where they came from. But there have been stories and there have been sagas and rumors of other people coming to the Americas, maybe from across the Pacific or in the east from across the Atlantic. And this looks like evidence that maybe some of those stories are true. We need to investigate further. So, dear judge, you cannot give these bones back. They're the only ones we have that have this kind of evidence. And if you give it to the Indians, not give it back, but if you give it to the Indians, then they're going to bury it and they're going to put it away where no one will ever see it. And we will have no way of examining further this exciting new idea that might give us a great advance in science. So, these are the two arguments. Now, there's a subtext to this argument here that became apparent as the two sides were making the argument. And that is that there are, well, I'll put it this way. The Indians, and not just the Umatilla Indians, but Indians throughout North America, have, with very good reason, felt that they have been on the wrong end of American policy for generations. And they have had their land stolen from them, they have suffered disease, they've been impoverished, and that it was about time that sort of they got something back. And so various Indian tribes had been suing for restitution, for reparations for lands taken. And they had reached the point, understandably so, where they were tugging at the conscience of America. Because, America became great sort of on the backs or on the land that was taken from the Indians. And there were a lot of people who were saying that, okay, we ought to do something for the Indians because they've suffered this great wrong. Now, the Indians recognized that if it turned out that they weren't the only ones there, if there had been other people there, then their claim to the land, their ancestral claim to the land, would be weaker than otherwise. The Indians took the position this was always our land, and therefore you stole it from us. But what if somebody else had been there, some other group of people had been there, a group of people who were no longer there, but who had been there at one time? Then it would suggest that the recent Indian groups holding the land had taken it from a previous group. And that would tend to weaken the moral claim of the Umatilla Indians. And this would apply to Indian claims all over the United States. So there was that part of it. And the flip side of this is that people who were skeptical, or at least reluctant to go along with the Indian claims, their argument would be strengthened. Because many of them had been saying, yeah, maybe the Umatilla Indians, to take that tribe, were here when the most recent wave of immigrants came, but the Umatilla Indians hadn't been there forever, and there are plenty of examples of Indian tribes basically stealing the land they wound up with previous tribes. And so, for example, in Texas, the Comanche Indians invaded Texas at about the same time that Americans were approaching Texas from the east. And the Comanches drove out the Apaches and other tribes, so that when the land was finally taken by the whites from the Comanche Indians, there was less of a feeling that, oh, we stole the land from the Indians who had had it forever, because it was clear that the Comanches had not had that land forever. Anyway, so these are the arguments that are swirling around in the court. So, I put it to you, you're the judge. What would you do? Would you give the skeleton to the Umatilla Indians and please the Corps of Engineers at the same time? Or would you say, no, it is in the realm of science, and the scientists can continue to investigate, to examine, to see what they can make of this? What do you do? Well, I'll tell you what the judge did. He didn't do it all by himself. So there were a bunch of lawsuits and court cases and everything, but to summarize, it kind of kicked its way through the courts time after time after time. It took finally 8 years before there was a decision made. But in the meantime, the bones were locked up in a vault where they were safe. The scientists couldn't get at them, and the Umatilla Indians couldn't get at them. And so nobody knew who this Kennewick man was and what his background really was, and the case was in limbo. Well, finally, well, not quite finally, but the next decision, it came, as I say, after years, was that this does not appear to be a Native American. It appears to be somebody else. Of course, this raises the whole question of who's a Native American if this person had been here 8,000 years ago. But more precisely, this person is not a member of the tribes suing. And even more importantly, Congress, before this all started, a few years before this all started, had passed a new law strengthening the claims of Indians to any remains found on their land. And notice that this wasn't Indian land, but it was land that sort of acted as though it was Indian land because the Corps of Engineers were on the side of the Indians. Anyway, so the decision is made. This does not fall under what was called the American Antiquities Act. This is somebody else. The scientists may continue to do their investigation. So the scientists clap their hands, we won the case. And they conduct their investigation, and top people are brought in from all over the world to say there's a real buzz around this, because this could be a breakthrough in understanding how North America came to be peopled. And they do all sorts of tests, and they measure bones, and they do more radiocarbon dating, and they compare the bones to this and that, and the skull and everything else. And they come to the conclusion that this, well, I'm going to call him Kennewick man. Kennewick man was not a member of any of the local tribes and not a feasible ancestor of any of the local tribes. Kennewick man looked most like a member of a certain group, a small group living in Japan. And they're the Ainu, A-I-N-U, live in Japan. And if Kennewick man was related to anybody, he's related to them. Oh, now this caused a great stir in the field of archaeology and anthropology. And it revived ideas that there had been this emigration across the Pacific Ocean. And in fact, one guy decided that he was going to demonstrate that this could be done. So he basically built himself a prehistoric kayak and paddled from Japan to North America. And so this is an example of, how he could have done it. And so the scientists write their report, and the report goes out saying, okay, this is a revolutionary new finding. Nobody can quite figure out for sure who this guy was, how he got there, but it has caused a big stir. Well, all of this goes on, and the Umatilla Indians, they're very discouraged by all of this until the examination goes on long enough that new techniques are developed over this. So we're now in the period from about 2005, as I say, the court case dragged on, then the investigation dragged on. So this is a period from about 2005 to around 2012 or 13. And during this time, new techniques for examining DNA, more precisely for retrieving DNA from really old things that used to be alive, from really old bones, for example, and digging out the marrow and then making sense of the DNA. So new techniques have been developed. So they bring the bones back out of the vault, the refrigerated vault. They bring them out of the vault so that they're going to do the DNA test. And they do a DNA test on it, and oh my gosh, it overturns the findings of the whole scientific world, basically. And it says that the DNA of Kennewick man is closest to the DNA of the Umatilla Indians, after all. And the scientists had to accept the DNA evidence. All the other stuff was kind of circumstantial, but in this world, DNA doesn't lie, or at least it gets closer to the truth than anything else. So the scientists basically have to retreat. They have to backtrack and say, we got it wrong. That Kennewick man is actually the ancient one. The ancient one that the Umatillas had said all along. So, the end of it now, I can't actually say that it was the same judge who rendered the final decision, but for the sake of our argument, you're the judge now. And so what you finally do is you say, all right, the scientific verdict is in. Kennewick man is the ancient one. And so in 2017, not that long ago, the bones were handed over to representatives of the Umatilla Indians. And with great ceremony, and this is a key, in great secrecy, the ancient one was taken away far safely from the banks of the river. No more river eroding the bones out. The ancient one was taken away and in great secrecy was quietly buried. No one knows where the ancient one is today. Well, presumably some of the Umatilla Indians do, the ones who were there, but there were only a very few. And they're not speaking for a very good reason. So that's the story of Kennewick man. What does it tell us? It tells us that, well, science changes, but for our larger purposes, it tells us that this question of who got here first is a very controversial one. And at the moment, the Indian side of the story seems to be the most persuasive. But science marches on, and maybe new evidence will be unearthed one day. But that's where it is for now. Okay.